Bjorn Lomberg is a Danish author and president of the Copenhagen Consensus Center, and in his book, The Skeptical Environmentalist, Lomberg challenges mainstream climate concerns, advocating for smarter solutions to address environmental issues. He argues for prioritizing economic and developmental goals. Here he talks why he became skeptical about mainstream environmentalism and green policies.
So I was an old Greenpeacer, not in the sense I was out in the rubber boat, but I had the poster and the backpack and the badge, and I had all those sorts of middle class worried.
And you grew up in Sweden.
In Denmark, yeah,
Oh,
it's
Denmark,
same.
okay.
And
Yeah.
certainly from here. But fundamentally, I was very worried. I thought the world was coming off, the wheels were coming off the cart. That's a bad metaphor, the way I just formulate. I thought things were going wrong and we needed to do better. And I thought, the environmentalist was telling a very important story. The world is getting worse and worse. We need to do a lot of stuff to do it. I realized that's not what the data mostly tells us. Actually, as we become richer, we have in most important areas, both of environment and also non-environment, fixed a lot of problems. Remember, air pollution used to be terrible in most rich countries. It was terrible in London around 1900. Since then, air pollution has come down dramatically for many reasons, partly because air pollution is an indication that you're producing inefficiently. So you can actually do better by reducing pollution. But also, as you get richer, it's also just simply, I'm richer, I'd like to cough a little less. So let's do more regulation and make sure that we actually get cleaner air. We have gotten incredibly clean air. We probably have cleaner air today in most rich countries than we've had for the last at least 400 or 500 years. This is a tremendous achievement. We have the same thing with water and many other places. It is important to say that there are still environmental problems, but it's incredibly important to recognize we have solved many more problems than we have caused new ones. We're not sort of a plague on the planet. And of course, also, if this scare story, the end is nigh, is not correct, it's probably also important to not let us be scared into spending money, but actually keep asking, what is smart spending? And that's what I did on the climate and in general on the environmental front. And I think that pissed off a lot of people because a lot of environmental movement is basically predicated on the idea of, I'm going to scare you witless, and then I'm going to ask for all your money, and then we're going to fix the problem. Well, that's not how you should fix problems. You should actually get a sense of how big of a problem is it, what can we do, what it'll cost, what are the alternatives.
So certainly in developed countries, air quality is better. I think in every city in America, the air quality is better now than it was 30 years ago or 40 years ago. And, for libertarians, part of that, we have to work through it, that it's the result of regulation. It's the result of laws. But one argument is that, well, we've just shoved all of our pollution onto the developing world. And when you look at emerging economies like China in particular, the air quality there is getting worse and worse. Is that an accurate read, or what is that missing?
So there's definitely a sense in which we've pushed some pollution, but remember, for instance, you can't push transportation pollution on other countries because you need the transportation here. And what we've done is also dramatically reduced air pollution from transportation. So we really have made our world cleaner. But remember, for poor countries, typically you'll do exactly the same thing as what America and the UK did back in the early part of industrialization. Said, hey, if I can get rich, I'm willing to cough more. That's how it works, that you're willing to trade off. If you can get better off and send your kids to college and have a lot of other benefits, you're willing to also accept more pollution, certainly in the short run. That's what they've done in poor countries, and certainly Beijing and China for a long time was getting worse and worse air pollution levels. Now you've actually seen this turn in many of the richest developing countries. So Chile, for instance, have already 20 or 30 years ago seen starting declining levels of air pollution. China has probably just broken this level again. But in India and other places where you're much poorer, you're still seeing air pollution levels going up. Most of this is a very conscious choice of saying, we'd like to get richer, and part of the way we get richer is by allowing more air pollution. It's only once you get sufficiently rich, you say, now I'd like to pay for less air pollution.
Is there any...
So what indeed is the remedy when a nation's actions pose an environmental dilemma for the entire globe? Isn't this a situation that necessitates a resolution at an international level? This point serves as a focal discussion where numerous individuals highlight the challenges associated with climate change.
Remember, air pollution is really a local issue, or at best a regional issue. So it makes sense to say, look, what China wants of its air pollution is mostly a problem for China. They can decide that level for themselves. But the crux here is that's not true for global warming, because global warming really comes from emitting CO2, and no matter where you emit CO2, it has the same global effect just over a couple of years or so. So this is really a global issue. It doesn't help that the US cuts its emissions if it just means they're transferred over to China or elsewhere. So you really have to get everybody on board. Now, remember, nobody emits CO2 because they think it's fun or they want to annoy Al Gore. They do this because it's a side effect of using power, which is one of the most advantageous things in the world. Remember, a couple of generations ago, we were basically all struggling just to get through life. Most of us working on farms, being incredibly poor, with our own muscles as the only thing that we could work with. Now we have all this energy, mostly fossil fuel energy, that basically provides servants. You and I and most rich people have servants equivalent to somewhere between 100 and 200 people working 24/7 for you. That's the Roomba you have, the horses in your car, and all these other things that provide all these amazing benefits that we have. The point here is to say there is a real problem from climate change, but there is also a real benefit to all of these very tangible things. When you go out and tell new countries, no, I'm sorry, I know we got rich with fossil fuels and that was really cool for us, but you can't do it. You can't develop this way. You have to use solar and wind. Now, if solar and wind was so great that they're actually cheaper, which of course a lot of people will claim, then it might make sense, but then you wouldn't have to tell the people because they would just do it because it was cheaper. But of course, that's not actually true. That's why we have to subsidize them here. That's why we have to push them onto poor people. Fundamentally, solar and wind is cheaper, maybe when the sun is shining and the wind is blowing, but when it's not, it's infinitely expensive. And that's why most people just have it as a little boutique add-on. In reality, most countries will only get rich if they have lots of power, cheaply available, and available 24/7. And that will typically, right now, mostly be fossil fuel. So when we're telling countries, I'm sorry, you can't have that, we are in effect telling you will have to do with less growth.
What is forgotten in all the mainstream discussion on climate change is that free market economic incentives can provide solutions to climate change. If there's a demand for green and substantial products or technologies, the market responds by supplying them, driven by the profit motive. Competition also fosters innovation as companies and entrepreneurs seek to outdo each other in developing more substantial and cost-effective solutions, ultimately leading to advancements and breakthroughs in green and more energy-efficient technologies.
So there's two things you have to recognize in this. One is the economically effective solution is a carbon tax. Any economist would say you should have a tax that equals the disbenefit of emitting CO2, and that means you've now internalized it, and then we should shut up about it. If you get that right in the system will solve itself. That's what the market mechanism does. So first of all, this has to be about how big of a problem is climate change? Because if climate change right now, a lot of people will tell you it's an existential crisis, it's the end of the world. Then of course, you have to do everything and the kitchen sink to fix this problem. But that's not what the UN Climate Panel tells us. What it tells us is it's a problem, it's not the end of the world, and that's why you can actually fix it with a carbon tax. But you have to recognize this will always ever only be a smaller part of the actual solution. You'll get a little reduction in CO2 emissions, but that's about it. The only way you're going to solve this is through innovation. That's how we solved all other problems. You don't solve problems by telling people, I'm sorry, could you be a little colder, a little more uncomfortable, a little poorer, but use these things that are nicer for the world. That just doesn't work in general, and certainly in the long run and for all countries. The way you solve this is by making sure that green energy is actually cheaper and more effective. Look at what happened with fracking in the US. You had a situation where you used a lot of coal because that was by far the cheapest way to generate electricity. Unfortunately, coal is also the biggest polluter of CO2. What came along was you basically had this new technology that made fracking, that made gas much cheaper. Gas produces about half as much CO2 as coal. So suddenly you had a situation where something that was greener was also cheaper. Everyone switched. You had a dramatic reduction in the production of coal.
But now in the U.S., and Joe Biden has banned fracking on federal lands. Environmentalists, I was just looking at this the other day. We ran an article 10 years ago. Environmentalists used to be for fracking before they were against it. No, the green movement doesn't like fracking anymore.
No. And look, there's some sense to this because what they say is also we need to move, we moved from a high fossil fuel to a medium fossil fuel, if you will, to gas. But eventually we need to move to zero emissions. And that makes sense that then, you can't just keep on doing fracking, but you also got to be realistic. Most of the world is going to be using more and more fossil fuels for the foreseeable future. And so what you want to do is to make sure that China goes from coal to gas, not to say, no, you can't use either, and then of course just end up having China keep on using coal. So the reality here is, if you live in the real world, you should do a better rather than a poor option, instead of saying, no, it all has to be pure or nothing.
Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoy videos like this, please subscribe and hit the notification bell.